Our next speaker will take some questions, which is a good idea. May I introduce Professor Avi Shlaim? He will join us shortly. Emeritus Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of the British Academy. Writer of several books, one which struck me forcibly and informed my thinking was The Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World from 2014. Currently, Avi is working on an autobiographical book. So Avi was born in Iraq, and the title of the book is Three Worlds, Memoir of an Arab Jew, to be published next summer. And Avi's talk today is from Balfour to Bevin, so from 1917 to 1948, Britain's betrayal of Palestine. And just to repeat, welcome Avi, just to repeat, at the end of Avi's talk, I will transmit questions to him if you care to write them into the chat. And we'll cover as many as we can in the time available. And we'll run until about 5:25. Over to you, Avi.
Hello. Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can see it. We can see and hear you, and we're impressed by the number of books.
Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you, Sir Vincent. I'm very happy to be taking part in this very important conference of the Balfour Project. It is striking how many British betrayers of Palestine have names which begin with B. First, there is the country itself, Britain, and then there is Balfour, Bevin, Blair, and Boris. I've given one talk about Britain's betrayal of Palestine from Balfour to Blair, and I've given another talk with the same title, with the subtitle was From Balfour to Boris. It's the same sad story, I only have to update it. Today we're talking about the collapse of the British mandate in Palestine, but I would like to start with the present incumbent in number 10 Downing Street. Boris Johnson, in his 2014 book on Churchill, The Churchill Factor, wrote that the Balfour Declaration was, quote, bizarre, a tragically incoherent document, and an exquisite piece of Foreign Office Futurama, unquote. I couldn't have put it better myself. This is a rare example of sound judgment and historical perspective coming from our Prime Minister. On the other hand, a year later, in 2015, on a trip to Israel as Mayor of London, Boris hailed the Balfour Declaration as a great thing. So apparently there is no limit to Boris's duplicity, and here he personifies the British position on Palestine all along. An unbroken thread of duplicity and skullduggery connects British foreign policy from Balfour to Boris Johnson. Today's session is about the British mandate in Palestine from 1920 to 1948. But the story starts with the original sin, with the Balfour Declaration. Sir John Chancellor, who was a British High Commissioner to Palestine, described the Balfour Declaration as a colossal strategic blunder. I agree. In my view, the Balfour Declaration was one of the worst mistakes in British foreign policy in the first half of the 20th century. To borrow a phrase from Talleyrand, it was worse than a crime, it was a mistake. There is an Arabic saying that something that starts crooked remains crooked, and this is a case in point. The key to understanding British policy during this period is British imperial interest, geopolitical interest, strategic imperatives. In World War I, Britain was in desperate need of allies. It therefore made the three famous promises on the future of Palestine. In 1915, it promised Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca, an independent kingdom, an independent Arab kingdom, if he, for his part, would mount an Arab revolt against the Ottomans. The Sharif Hussein kept his side of the bargain, but Britain reneged on its part of the bargain. The debate revolved around whether or not Palestine was included in the promise of an independent Arab kingdom. Britain tried to wriggle out it by pretending that Palestine was never promised to the Sharif. This is completely wrong. The Sharif was right. Britain lied to him and betrayed him. In 1916, Britain signed a secret agreement with France, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. As the two colonial powers could not agree about Palestine, they placed it under a separate international administration. But this flatly contradicted the promise of an independent kingdom to the Sharif Hussein of Mecca. Worse was to come. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration in support of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, with a well-known caveat about Palestinian rights. The difference between the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration is that the first was never implemented. Britain reneged on the Sykes-Picot Agreement, whereas the Balfour Declaration was fully implemented. The Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration constitute the main terms of reference of Arab nationalists ever since. The Sykes-Picot Agreement is a symbol of Western attempts to carve up the Middle East into spheres of influence, of Western intervention in the area to promote their own colonial imperial interests, whereas the Balfour Declaration is a symbol of the Western attempt to impose a foreign entity, a foreign people in the heartland of the Arab world. And it is ever since then that Arab nationalists have regarded Israel not as a genuine entity, but as an artificial entity, an outpost of Western imperialism in the Middle East. The Balfour Declaration is only 67 words long, but it had far-reaching consequences for Jews, for Arabs, and for the entire region. The literature on the British Mandate in Palestine is vast, but I can summarize my take in one sentence. Britain stole Palestine from the Palestinians and gave it to the Zionists. The Zionist movement was Britain's junior ally in the dispossession of the Palestinians. Zionism is a settler colonial movement, and the State of Israel, its principal political progeny, is a colonial settler state. Noam Chomsky once observed that settler colonialism is the most extreme and sadistic form of imperialism. The Palestinians have the misfortune of being at the receiving end of both Zionist settler colonialism and British imperialism. Elizabeth Monroe called her book, or her classic book on Britain and the Middle East, Britain's moment in the Middle East. In a long historical perspective, this was a fleeting moment, but its consequences for the Arabs were devastating and enduring. Britain denied the Arabs independence, freedom, and democracy. The hallmark of British policy towards Palestine was double standards, one standard for Jews and one standard for Arabs. The French called Britain perfidious Albion, not without reason. But France was no less perfidious. Perfidy and egotism are in the DNA of all colonial powers. The Jewish writer Arthur Koestler famously described the Balfour Declaration as a statement in which one nation promised to a second nation the country of a third. There is no basis in international law for the newfangled concept of a national home. For the Zionists and for the chief supporters in Britain, Balfour, Lloyd George, and Churchill, from the beginning, a national home was just a euphemism for a state. In 1917, as is well known, the Arabs constituted 90% of the population of the country. The Jews constituted 10%, and the Jews owned only 2% of the land. These are key facts, incontrovertible facts. And these facts make the Balfour Declaration a classic colonial document, an act, a colonial document which completely disregarded the rights and aspirations of the majority of the population of the country. The driving force behind the Balfour Declaration was not Balfour, but Prime Minister Lloyd George. In domestic politics, Lloyd George was a Welsh radical, but in foreign policy, he was an old-fashioned British imperialist and a land grabber. LG wanted Palestine for two reasons: to exclude the French and to secure British control over the access to the Suez Canal. Giving Palestine to the Zionists was an indirect and devious way of reneging on the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Moreover, LG knew that the majority of British Jews were opposed to Zionism. So why did he privilege the Zionists? Tom Segev, in his book One Palestine Complete suggests the answer. The answer is that Lloyd George had a highly inflated idea of the international influence of the Jews. His support for Zionism was based on a misperception. In aligning Britain with Zionism, he acted in the mistaken, and I may add, the anti-Semitic view that Jews had covert power, the Jews had subterranean power, that they made the wheels of history turn. The reality was that the Jews were helpless with nothing to offer, and the Zionists were a minority within an impotent minority. The great majority of influential English Jews were opposed to the nationalist idea inherent in Zionism. Sir Edwin Montagu, the Secretary of State for India, was the only Jew in Lloyd George's cabinet. On the 23rd of August, 1917, Montagu submitted a memorandum to the cabinet under the heading, "The Anti-Semitism of the present government." The anti-Semitism of the present government. The memorandum was 4 pages long, but in a nutshell, it argued that Judaism is a religion, not a nation. And to establish a Jewish state in Palestine would undermine the struggle for equal rights for Jews in Britain, in Europe, and elsewhere. Because if there was a Jewish state in Palestine and Jews were being difficult, people would say to them, why don't you go to your own country? So this memorandum is very significant, and it sums up the Jewish case against Zionism. But the cabinet opted for the Balfour Declaration. Dr. Chaim Weizmann was sitting in the antechamber as the cabinet was deliberating. When they had finished deliberating, the secretary of the cabinet, Sir Mark Sykes, the same Sykes of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, came out and said and announced, "Dr. Weizmann, it's a boy." This is an early and a very striking illustration of how close the Zionists were to the centers of power in Britain. The next important landmark is the League of Nations mandate to Britain over Palestine. This is highly significant because what had been a merely British promise to a group of people became an international document, an international instrument, an obligation, a formal obligation for the British government to implement the Balfour Declaration, which was incorporated into the mandate. To be sure, the mandate, it was a dual mandate with an obligation towards the Jews, but also an obligation towards the Palestinians. The mandate was described as a sacred trust of civilization. The British mandate was unique. All the other mandates, the mandate to France for Syria and Lebanon, and the mandate to Britain over Iraq, all these other mandates called on the mandatory power to prepare the country for self-government. The Palestine mandate was different because it incorporated the Balfour Declaration. So in effect, the mandatory power was asked to prepare the country not for self-government by its own people, but to prepare it for independence by bringing to Palestine the Jews from Europe and anywhere else in the world. As the mandatory power, Britain favored the Zionists from the very beginning. The first High Commissioner for Palestine was Sir Herbert Samuel, who was both a Jew and an ardent Zionist. The Palestinians demanded a democratically elected National Assembly and a democratic government. Whitehall refused. Sir Martin Gilbert, who is no friend of the Palestinians, who was a passionate Zionist, wrote the following: "The cornerstone of mandatory policy was to withhold representative institutions so long as there was in Palestine an Arab majority." In other words, withhold elections until the Jews became the majority. As a result of this one-sided British policy, which encouraged Jewish immigration from Europe to Palestine, an Arab revolt broke out in 1936. Major General Bernard Montgomery was sent to Palestine to suppress the revolt. When he arrived, his advisors tried to brief him about the background to the conflict. Monty cut them short. He gave them straightforward orders: kill all the troublemakers. And indeed, the Arab revolt was suppressed by the British Army with the utmost brutality, with torture, which included torture, murder, collective punishment, detention without trial, military courts, and aerial bombardment. Rashid Khalidi, the Palestinian historian, has argued that Palestine was not lost in the late 1940s, that it was lost in the late 1930s. He advances this argument in his chapter on the Palestinians in the book that Eugene Rogan and I co-edited, called The War for Palestine, Rewriting the History of 1948. And Khalidi's argument is that it was because of the brutality with which Britain crushed the Palestinian resistance in the late 1930s, that by the time the critical phase in the struggle for Palestine began in 1947, the Jews were ready and the Palestinians had very little. This brings me to the 1948 war. There is a debate between the Zionist historians and revisionist Israeli historians, or new historians as we are called, about Britain's role as the Mandate approached its inglorious end. The standard Zionist rendition of events says that as Britain withdrew from Palestine, it did not accept that there would be a Jewish state, and it incited, armed, and encouraged its Arab allies to invade Palestine upon expiry of the British Mandate and to strangle the infant Jewish state at birth. Ilan Pape, my fellow new historian, and I contest this version of events. We accept that there is a case to be made against British policy towards the end of the mandate. But the case is not that it tried to suppress a Jewish state, but it set out and succeeded in aborting the birth of a Palestinian state. Ilan Pappé does this in his book, Britain and Palestine, Britain and the Arab-Israeli Conflict, 1948-1951. And I argue this in my book, Collusion Across the Jordan, King Abdallah, the Zionist Movement, and the Partition of Palestine. Hostility towards the Palestinians is a constant factor in British policy in 1948. In British eyes, a Palestinian state was synonymous with a Mufti state. And therefore, Britain did not genuinely accept the UN resolution for the partition of Palestine, but left it for the two sides to fight it out. The key to Ernest Bevin's policy during this period was Greater Transjordan, to support King Abdallah's bid, King Abdallah of Transjordan, to support his bid to grab the West Bank, the heartland of what was to be the Palestinian state. Abdallah was Britain's client. He was also, in the phrase of one British official, a born land grabber. So were the Zionists. 1948 became a general land grab. The winners were Israel, which in the course of the war increased its territory from the 55% of Palestine assigned by the UN cartographers to 78% of the country, and King Abdallah, who captured and later annexed the West Bank to his kingdom. The losers were the Palestinians. Roughly 750,000, roughly 750,000 Palestinians became refugees, and the name Palestine was wiped off the map. This is the Nakba. But the Nakba is not a one-off event, it's an ongoing process. The Israeli occupation continues, and the Israeli occupation, to judge by the events of the last few days, is getting more and more extreme, vicious, and sadistic by the day. My conclusion is that Britain's record in Palestine in the last 105 years is shameful and indefensible. In Palestine, Britain empowered and enabled a small minority to start the systematic takeover of the country. Britain, in fact, overfulfilled its promise to the Palestinians. It promised to view with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jews in Palestine, but it ended up helping them to achieve a fully fledged state. On the other hand, and by the same token, Britain betrayed the sacred trust of the civilization to the Palestinian majority. This is a sad story of double standards, broken promises, and betrayals stretching all the way from Arthur Balfour to Boris Johnson. Hence, the importance of the Balfour Project and the importance of this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Avi. And thank you for being with us. Unsurprisingly, we have many questions, and I will transmit to you any that we do not cover in the next 20 minutes. Can I start with one from, let me get it right, from Sasha Moonsami. Thank you for the discussion, for the presentation. How is one able to make sense of the horrendous impact of Western imperialism and colonialism with their far-reaching consequences, particularly in Palestine? Similar occurrences have happened in South Africa, and as a nation, it could only go forward once open and honest discussions were had. At the moment, Palestinians are not involved in any political decision-making, and when this is aired with reference to Israel, this is viewed as anti-Semitism. That's his question, Avi. If you can pick the bones out of that, I guess it's a comparison between South Africa under de Klerk and the situation that Israel-Palestine faces today.
It's a very valid comparison between apartheid South Africa and the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories. Israelis don't like this comparison, but in the last year, there have been 4 major reports by human rights organizations which reach the same conclusion. B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and I think there was one other. They are all based on serious research. In the case of Amnesty International, 4 years of research, and they all reach the same conclusion. The really significant report was the first one by B'Tselem, the highly respected Israeli human rights organization. In the past, B'Tselem used to write reports only about the occupied territories. But in this report, it says it's no longer valid to distinguish between the occupied territories and Israel proper. It's one regime. And it's a Jewish supremacist regime that controls the whole area from the river to the sea. There is another word for this situation, which is an ethnocracy. Israel prides itself on being a democracy, but if you look at the reality from the river to the sea, it's an ethnocracy. It's a regime in which one ethnic group dominates and controls the other. Hence, it is right to compare present-day Israel with apartheid South Africa. And one reason that I'm hopeful that this situation will end is because I do not believe that apartheid in the 21st century is sustainable over the long term. So like Hanan Ashrawi, I'm pessimistic at the moment, but I'm optimistic in the long term.
Can I put 2 questions together because they are compatible, I think. First, from Hanin Abu Salam, Professor Shlaim, what solution would you propose to solving the conflict? And what is your view on the one-state solution proposed by Dr. Karmi and others? And then Bettina Marks, can the wrong done by the Balfour Declaration be rectified or repaired? Do you see any chance that Palestinians will gain their rights either in their own state or in one state between the river and the sea? Those are the 2 questions, Avi.
I'm a pensioner, so I can only cope with one question at a time. So I'll start with the one-state solution, and then I may have to ask you to remind me of the second question. As far as the one-state solution is concerned, I've undergone a change over the years. Throughout most of my academic career, I supported a two-state solution, not because it was the perfect solution, not because it would have provided absolute justice for the Palestinians, but in the real world, there is no such a thing as absolute justice. But here are what Edward Said called two communities of suffering. And the Palestinians are victims, but they are the victims of victims because the Jews in their time had also been victims. So the most fair, rational solution that one could think of was to partition the land between Palestinians and Israelis, to establish an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel on the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and capital city in East Jerusalem. And essentially, by signing the Oslo Accord, the PLO signed on to the two-state solution. And there's been the broadest international consensus behind the two-state solution, and there is still today. But Israel destroyed the possibility of a two-state solution by expanding settlements, constantly expanding settlements, and all the settlements are illegal without exception. The annexation of East Jerusalem is illegal. The annexation of the Golan Heights, although that's not Palestinian, is illegal. The wall, the security wall that Israel has built on the West Bank is illegal. And it is said to be for security, but it also serves the purpose of land grabbing. So Israel, by its actions, has made a viable Palestinian state impossible. It has become fashionable to say that the two-state solution is dead. I will go further and argue that the two-state solution was never born, in the sense that no Israeli government since 1967 has offered a plan for a two-state solution which is acceptable even to the most moderate Palestinians. Moreover, no American administration since 1967 has really pushed Israel into a two-state solution. So this is mere words. It's kalam fadi, it's empty talk, the two states. Therefore, what is the solution? And I've come to the conclusion that the only fair solution is one democratic state with equal rights for all its citizens, regardless of ethnicity and religion. So this is where I stand now. And I'm not reluctantly driven to the one-state solution. On the contrary, I think it's a noble vision. What could be more noble than Arabs and Jews living together in one state with equal rights for all? So that's my answer to the first question. The first question was, remind me.
I believe, to be honest, I believe you've answered it, which is why I put them together. You have put your voice to the one-state solution. Can I take you to a question by Gillian Mosley, director of the Tinderbox film? She says, I have noticed that when talking with enthusiastic Zionists, that history is used randomly to support their claims, therefore delinking those incidents from chronology and context. Other than repeating chronology and context, are there ways that the weakness in this approach could be exposed, could be demonstrated?
First of all, I recommend Gillian Mosley's film, Tinderbox, to all the participants. And secondly, I will answer her question, which is that by saying that all national movements rewrite their history. All national movements have a nationalist version of history, and the Zionist movement is no exception. Isaiah Berlin used to say that the Jews are like any other people, only more so. By the same token, Zionist historiography is like any other nationalist historiography, only more so. Nationalist versions of history tend to have a number of features in common. They tend to be simplistic, selective, self-serving, and self-righteous. So as Gillian says, Zionists are very selective in their interpretation of history. This is where the new history comes in. The new history were the books published by Benny Morris on the origins of the Palestinian refugee problem, Ilan Pape on Britain in 1948, and my own book on collusion across the Jordan. We were collectively called the new historians, or revisionist Israeli historians. When between us, we mounted a frontal attack on all the myths that have come to surround the birth of Israel and the first Arab-Israeli war. Edward Said, who was not a historian, said that the new history serves three purposes. First, it educates Israelis about the history of the conflict. Second, it gives the Palestinians a version of history which is genuine, which is true, which is in line with their own experience, which is in line with the experience of Rada Karmi in 1948, instead of the usual propaganda of the victors. And thirdly, honest history encourages an honest dialogue and is therefore conducive to a climate which is more tolerant, which is more understanding of the other, and therefore more conducive to a historic reconciliation.
May I ask a question which comes from Wissam Bustani, world-famous flautist and supporter of PAL music. The conference demonstrates that the Palestinian issue cannot be seen in isolation outside the context of the wider global fragmentation of our humanity as a result of the power structures that have dominated our planet for many decades. I guess we're talking about imperialism and so on, and being the root of countless wars and suffering, the latest flashpoint being Ukraine, Russia. My question, is there any hope that these power structures can ever be reinvented to rebuild hope for the future of our humanity, including Palestine and many countries and their citizens who have been destroyed in, I guess, imperial wars? Avi.
It's always good to live in hope, but just now we are faced with one of the most egregious examples of double standards by the international community. So Russia invaded Ukraine, and as Hanana Shrawi pointed out, within 6 days, the ICC sent an advance party and started an investigation of war crimes. In fact, she was wrong, because on the second day of the invasion, the chief prosecutor of the ICC announced he's going to investigate, and he then sent an advance party. Whereas it took the ICC 5 or 6 years to investigate war crimes in the occupied territories. The Palestinian Authority submitted a complaint in 2015, and there was a preliminary probe, but the chief prosecutor sat on the fence for 5 years before announcing in December 2019 that she would launch a full investigation of war crimes. This hasn't happened yet. So you couldn't have a more striking example of double standards. And no one is more guilty of double standards on this issue than the British government and the Prime Minister more specifically. Boris Johnson sent a letter to the Conservative Friends of Israel, in which he said, we respect the independence of the International Criminal Court. But in this case, we think it'd be wrong to have an investigation because Israel is a close friend and ally of the United Kingdom. So there you have it. Because Israel is a friend and ally of the United Kingdom, it's above international law and it's above international scrutiny. This is precisely the problem with the international community and its approach to the Palestinian issue.
2 more questions, and then the break. From Ronald Mendel, can it be argued that the founders of Israel, in launching a war against a colonial power, i.e. the terrorism against the UK, the King David Hotel, etc., a war against the colonial power for an independent state, quote, disguised, unquote, their own settler colonialism?
Yes, I think it can, because Zionism was aligned from day one with a colonial power. The Zionist movement could never have made it on its own without the support and backing of the British colonial power. In fact, cardinal tenet of Zionist foreign policy was always to have on your side the preeminent Western power of the day. First it was Britain, and after the Second World War, it was America. Israel is a settler colonial state, but I wouldn't want to deny that there was also an element of Jewish national self-determination, a genuine element, a genuine Jewish desire for independence and freedom. But the War of Independence is called by Israelis, well, 1948 war, the War for Palestine is called the War for Independence. So you could say it was independence from the British, but what about the other people, the other community that lived there? Britain was quitting in any case, and therefore what happened was the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. In Zionist discourse from the late 1930s, there was always talk about transfer. But in 1948, when war broke out, there was an opportunity to implement the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. So I've already described the 48 war as a general land grab, but from the point of view of the Palestinians, it was also the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. So whichever way you look at it, the creation of the state of Israel involved a monumental injustice to the Palestinians.
Thank you, Avi. I repeat, any questions that we have not covered will be transmitted to you for you to see. Last question from Marcus Holside. one of the problems he identifies is that Jews living in the diaspora, I guess including the UK, who are compassionate and sympathetic to most disadvantaged people, tend to turn off when asked to show a similar degree of compassion towards Palestinians. Is there a way to address this? I would just add, as you're thinking, my impression that the peoples, the Palestinian people and the Jewish people of Israel, have grown apart over the decades, partly by governmental design, and that the knowledge that the other is the same as us is dwindling. But coming back to the question from Marcus, he's talking about the diaspora. Can you see a way to address the graduation of compassion?
Yes, it is true that in the past, the majority of Jews were Zionists and identified with the state of Israel, and this left little space for empathy with the Palestinians. But in the last decade or so, this has been changing, and changing very radically and fundamentally. Look at America. Today, young liberal Americans have great reservations about Israel. They want an end of the occupation, and they want a two-state solution. And maybe 70% of British Jews, or of American Jews, are of that opinion. And AIPAC, the lobby, represents a shrinking proportion of American Jews. And there is an American organization, a very powerful organization. It's called American Jews for Peace, I think. And there is the same trend in this country. The majority of Jews support Israel. Some support it unconditionally. Some still operate on the basis of my country, right or wrong. But this is changing. And I belong to a small group within the Labour Party called Jewish Voice for Labour. We belong to the left wing of the party. We are supporters of Jeremy Corbyn, and we are strong supporters of Palestinian rights. The trouble with the debate about anti-Semitism is that anti-Semitism, which is a real problem, a real phenomenon, has been weaponized to silence and discredit and stigmatize critics of Israel. So I'd like to make a very firm distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. The Jews are a people. Israel is a state, and therefore it's perfectly legitimate to criticize Israeli policies and practices, especially in relation to the Palestinians, without being in any way anti-Semitic. So I think that the trend is for more and more Jews to see the light, to recognize the injustice that have been done to the Palestinians, and to adopt a more fair-minded position in this conflict.
Thank you, Avi. Can I apologize to those many questioners whose questions I did not reach? But I repeat, we will transmit all questions and all comments to Avi that were raised during his talk. Can I thank you, Avi, for being with us? And we will now take a 5-minute break